Out of my house, Dad, tonight." That was my son-in-law talking, standing in my own kitchen. Well, the kitchen I'd been cooking breakfast in for 2 years, arms crossed, voice flat like he was dismissing a contractor who'd overcharged him. My daughter stood 3 feet behind him. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The look on her face said everything she wasn't willing to say out loud. I set down my coffee mug, slowly, and I looked at him, really looked at him, and I said nothing. Because there was nothing to say. Not yet. My name is Vincent. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as an electrical engineer for a mid-sized firm outside Columbus, Ohio. I retired at 62, collected my pension, and started doing what I'd been meaning to do for decades: fishing, woodworking, reading things I actually wanted to read instead of technical manuals. Then my wife passed. Lorraine died on a Tuesday in March, 2 years and 4 months before that moment in the kitchen. Pancreatic cancer. 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We didn't even have time to be properly scared before it was over. After she was gone, the house felt like a museum. Every room held something that reminded me of her. The garden she planted, the blue curtains she picked out for the living room, the dent in the couch cushion where she always sat with her book and her tea. I didn't fall apart. I want to be clear about that. I'm not a man who falls apart, but I was lonely in a way I hadn't expected. Not just sad, lonely. There's a difference. My daughter Cassandra called me every Sunday. She lives about 40 minutes away in a newer development outside Dublin, one of those neighborhoods with 3 different coffee shops within walking distance and houses that all look like they were copied from the same blueprint. She'd been married to her husband Thomas for 6 years. They had 2 children, my grandchildren, a boy named Eli, who was 7 at the time, and a girl named Rosalind, who had just turned 5. I loved those kids. I still do. That part never changed. About 8 months after Lorraine passed, Cassandra suggested I come stay with them. Just for a while, she said. The kids miss you, she said. You shouldn't be in that big house alone. Thomas, she told me, was on board. I should have asked more questions. I should have clarified what a while meant. I should have had a longer conversation with Thomas directly, not through my daughter like we were 2 parties in a negotiation who couldn't be in the same room. But I was grieving, and I missed my grandchildren, and honestly, I actually thought that being useful to them would help me heal. So I agreed. I didn't move in empty-handed. I want to make that part very clear, because it matters to what came later. I sold my house in Westerville, the house Lorraine and I had owned outright for 12 years, and I put most of that money into a trust and 2 investment accounts that I'd built up over 3 decades of careful saving. I'm not going to throw a number out right now, but I will say this. I had enough that I never had to ask anyone for anything, ever. What I did do was contribute to the household. I paid Thomas and Cassandra $1,200 a month toward the mortgage. I paid for all the groceries. I picked up Eli from school every Tuesday and Thursday. I watched both kids every Friday so Cassandra and Thomas could have a date night. I fixed things around the house, the loose railing on the back deck, the bathroom faucet that had been dripping for God knows how long, the basement drainage issue that a plumber had quoted them $4,000 to repair. I did that last one myself in a weekend. I also cooked dinner 4 nights a week, because Cassandra doesn't really cook and Thomas works late. I'm a decent cook. Lorraine taught me early in our marriage that a man who can't feed himself is a liability, and she was right about most things. For the first few months, it was fine. More than fine, actually. Eli and Rosalind were at the age where they still thought Grandpa was the best person in the room, and I won't pretend that didn't fill something in me that had gone quiet since Lorraine died. Thomas was polite. Distant, but polite. He traveled for work. He's in pharmaceutical sales, so he was gone 2 or 3 days most weeks. When he was home, we coexisted without friction. He watched sports. I watched documentaries. We were cordial at dinner. Then he got a promotion. New title, new territory, 20% raise. He came home that night, a Thursday in October, and there was champagne, and Cassandra was glowing, and I toasted with them and meant it. He'd worked hard for it. I didn't begrudge him the success. But something shifted after that. I noticed it within a few weeks. Thomas started making comments, small ones at first. The kind that you almost let slide because you think you're being too sensitive. He mentioned once that it would be great when I had my own place again. Said it lightly, laughing, like it was just a casual observation. He started referring to the guest bedroom as Dad's room, in a tone that italicized the word Dad in a way that didn't feel warm. He rearranged the garage without telling me, moving my tools into a corner and putting his golf equipment where my workbench had been. I said nothing. I'm 67. I have grandchildren who love me and a daughter who I believe fundamentally loves me. I didn't want to create conflict over a garage, but then came the conversation in the living room. It was a Sunday evening. The kids were in bed. Cassandra was sitting on the couch and Thomas was standing near the window with his arms crossed. In that way he has, like he's delivering a verdict, and he told me that things needed to evolve. He said they'd been thinking about it, and that now with his promotion and their new income level, they were considering doing renovations, adding a home office, converting the guest room, my room, into that office. He didn't say, "We need you to leave." He dressed it up. He talked about timelines and transitions, and how they just needed to plan things out. But the meaning was clear enough. I looked at Cassandra. She was looking at her hands. I asked her directly, "Do you want me to leave?" She said, "We're just talking about the future, Dad." That wasn't an answer, but it was an answer. I told them I understood. I said I'd think about it. And then I went upstairs and I sat on the edge of the bed that Lorraine and I had bought together 20 years ago. I'd brought it with me when I moved in, and I thought about things for a long time. I wasn't angry that night. Not yet. What I felt was something quieter and worse than anger. I felt like a fool. Not because I'd made a mistake in moving in. I'd done it for the right reasons. I felt like a fool because I had genuinely believed that my presence in that house was something they valued, and I was only now understanding what it actually was. I was the nanny. I was the handyman. I was the grocery bill. And now that Thomas had his promotion and didn't need the cushion of my $1,200 a month quite so much, the math had shifted. I started making plans quietly. That's always been my way. I don't broadcast. I don't make scenes. I just decide and then I do. I called my financial advisor, a woman I've worked with for 15 years named Judith, and I asked her to begin the process of liquidating one of my brokerage accounts into cash and consolidating my holdings. Not urgently, quietly. I put out some feelers about a condo in a 55-plus community in Worthington that I'd looked at briefly 2 years earlier and dismissed because I thought I wasn't ready to live alone. Now I thought I might be more ready than I'd realized. I did all of this over the following 6 weeks, and during those 6 weeks I continued cooking dinner, picking up Eli, watching Rosalind on Fridays, and paying my $1,200. I didn't change anything. I didn't say anything. Thomas, meanwhile, seemed to be operating on the assumption that his message had landed and I was processing it at his preferred pace, which was apparently faster than the one I was using. The breaking point came on a Wednesday night. I had made a pot roast, Lorraine's recipe, which takes all day and fills the house with a smell that I've been told by multiple people is genuinely wonderful. Eli had asked for it specifically earlier that week. Thomas came home in a bad mood. Some deal at work, something with a client. He walked in, ignored the pot roast, poured himself a bourbon, and sat down at the kitchen table with his laptop. I was at the stove. I said hello. He didn't answer. Cassandra came down a few minutes later with Rosalind, and we all sat down for dinner. Ellie was telling a story about something that happened at school, something with a soccer ball and a substitute teacher, and he was telling it the way 7-year-olds do, with too much detail and complete conviction that every word was fascinating. Thomas put his hand up, palm out, and said, "Ellie, stop. Daddy needs quiet tonight." Eli stopped mid-sentence. His face went a particular kind of blank, the one kids get when they're working out whether to cry or pretend they're not hurt. I looked at Thomas. Thomas was looking at his phone. I said nothing. I served the pot roast. We ate in silence. After dinner, after the kids were upstairs, Thomas closed his laptop and looked at me across the kitchen and said it. "Look, Vincent, I don't know how much longer this is working for us. We've been generous, letting you stay here as long as we have, but I think it's time you seriously started looking for somewhere else to be. This is our home, our family, and we need our space back." I heard every word. I noticed the word generous. I noticed letting you stay. I noticed our family, as if I had somehow misunderstood my position in that family, as if I were a tenant who'd overstayed a lease rather than the man whose daughter grew up calling him daddy, rather than the grandfather of those two children upstairs. I looked at Thomas for a long moment. Then I said, "Okay." Just that. Okay. He seemed to expect more. When he didn't get it, he nodded and walked out of the kitchen like he'd finished a difficult but necessary task. I washed the dishes. I dried them. I put them away. And then I went upstairs and I made a phone call to Judith. I moved out 15 days later. I want to tell you about those 15 days because they matter. I didn't tell Cassandra I had a timeline. I let her believe I was still thinking about it. I didn't want a conversation. I didn't want a conversation. I didn't want tears or apologies or renegotiations. I had made my decision the moment Thomas used the word generous, and I had no interest in revising it. What I did, quietly and without announcement, was stop. I stopped paying the $1,200. January 1st came and went, and no transfer went through. I didn't say anything about it. I wondered how long it would take them to notice. It took 9 days. I also called my attorney, a man named Allen who I've used for estate matters for 20 years, and I asked him to revise my will. The previous version had left everything, split evenly, to Cassandra and to a charitable fund I'd set up in Lorraine's name. I revised it so that Cassandra's share was redirected into a trust for Eli and Rosalind directly, with conditions they receive it at 25 in 3 installments for education and housing. Cassandra has no access to it. Thomas has no access to it. The charitable fund stayed exactly as it was. On day 12, I signed the lease on my condo in Worthington. 2-bedroom, 2nd floor with a small balcony that faces east and gets morning light. I'd bought new furniture, nothing extravagant, but mine chosen for my preferences, and I had it delivered on day 14. On day 15, I packed everything that was mine into my truck and a rented cargo van. I did it on a Tuesday morning while Thomas was at work and Cassandra had taken the kids to school. I left a note on the kitchen counter. The note said, "I've moved out. I'll be in touch with the kids. I wish you both well." I didn't put my new address on it. I drove to my condo, unloaded everything with the help of my neighbor Phil, a retired firefighter who'd offered when he saw me struggling with the headboard. And by 6 o'clock that evening, I was sitting on my new balcony with a cup of coffee, watching the light change over the tree line, and feeling something I hadn't felt in longer than I could immediately calculate. I felt like myself. I want to be honest with you about something. There was grief mixed in with that feeling. Cassandra is my daughter. I love her, and I was not naive enough to believe that what Thomas wanted had been entirely his idea. I'd seen enough of their dynamic over 2 years to understand who set the temperature in that house and who adjusted accordingly. I didn't excuse her for it, but I understood it, maybe more than I wanted to. The grief was for who she'd let herself become, or maybe who I'd been too hopeful to see clearly earlier. Cassandra called me 4 days after I left. She'd noticed the missing mortgage payment by then. Thomas had apparently flagged it, and she'd found my note, and she'd had 4 days to sit with the reality that her father had packed up and left without a conversation. I imagine that 4 days felt long. She was crying when I picked up, that immediate shallow crying that comes from someone who's been holding it for a while. She said she didn't know I was leaving. I said I told her I was thinking about it, and I had, and thinking about it had led to deciding, and now I was in my own home, and I was fine. She said she was sorry. I asked her what she was sorry for, specifically. Not to be cruel, I want to be clear about my intention there. I asked because sorry, said in a moment of panic, can mean many things. It can mean I'm sorry this happened to me. It can mean I'm sorry you're upset. Or it can mean I'm sorry for what I did and for what I allowed. There was a long silence. Then she said she was sorry she hadn't said anything that Sunday in the living room. When I'd looked at her and asked her directly if she wanted me to leave, and she'd looked at her hands, that was the right answer. It took 4 days and a shock to get there, but it was the right answer. I told her I accepted that. I meant it. We talked for 45 minutes. I told her about my condo, about Phil next door, about the balcony. She told me the kids were confused and asking where I was. That one moved me more than I let on. I told her I would very much like to have Eli and Rosalind come visit on weekends when everyone was comfortable with that. I told her that my relationship with those children was not something I had any interest in sacrificing, and that I hoped she felt the same. She did. What I did not tell her on that call was what I'd done with my will. I decided that was information for when the time was right, meaning when I felt confident that any reconciliation was genuine and not motivated by what I suspected Thomas had already started calculating. I didn't have to wait long to test that theory. Thomas called me on a Saturday 3 weeks after I'd left. I almost didn't answer, but I picked up because I believe in knowing what you're dealing with. He was friendly, warmer than he'd been in months, maybe more than he'd been in months, maybe more than he'd ever been with me. He asked how I was settling in. He mentioned he'd been under a lot of pressure at work. He talked around the edges of an apology without ever actually arriving at one, a skill some people spend their whole lives perfecting. Then, near the end of the call, he mentioned that they'd been looking at their finances and realized that without the monthly contribution I'd been making, the mortgage payment was a little tighter than expected, and he just wanted to make sure I knew I was always welcome back if I wanted to reconsider, and that they could certainly revisit the arrangements. I listened to the whole thing. Then I said very calmly that I was happy in my condo and had no plans to move again, and that I thought it was best for all of us that I had my own space. I said I would continue to have a relationship with my grandchildren and hoped that could be warm and uncomplicated. And I wished him a good rest of his weekend. He didn't call again. What I haven't told you yet, what I didn't tell anyone for a while, was the full picture of what I'd walked away with after the sale of the Westerville house, after 31 years of maxing out my 401k, after the investment accounts I'd been building since my late 30s, after Lorraine's life insurance. She'd insisted on a substantial policy, and I'd thanked her for that wisdom many times since. I had just over $1.4 million in liquid and invested assets, plus a pension that paid me $3,200 a month without me doing anything at all. I am not a wealthy man by the standards of people on television, but I am a man who will never need to ask his son-in-law for anything. Not ever. That wasn't the point, though. I want to make sure that's clear. The money was never the point. The point was the Tuesday and Thursday school pickups and the Friday evenings when I had both kids while Cassandra and Thomas went to dinner. The point was the pot roast and the grocery bills and the $4,000 I saved them on that basement drainage repair. The point was 2 years of being present and useful, and I had believed genuinely wanted. And then we've been generous letting you stay here. There's a thing that happens when you hear words like that. Not anger exactly, not at first. It's more like calibration, like something inside you quietly adjusts its understanding of where you are and what you're dealing with, the way a compass needle swings and settles. I had my calibration on a Wednesday night over a pot roast that no one complimented. I'm settled now. I have been for a while. I have a routine that is entirely my own. I wake up when I want to, which is usually around 6, because 67 years of early rising doesn't unwind easily. I make coffee and sit on my balcony and watch the neighborhood come alive. I go to the woodworking shop I set up in the storage unit 2 floors below. The building manager let me convert it. Don't ask me how I negotiated that. And I work on whatever I'm working on, which right now is a rocking chair that I intend to give to Eli when he's grown. I have dinner with Cassandra and the grandchildren every other Sunday. Thomas sometimes joins and sometimes has other plans, and I've stopped having any particular feeling about either outcome. We are civil. We may even be working towards something warmer than civil, slowly, on the margins. Ely and Rosalind come to my place on alternating Saturdays. Ely has decided that woodworking is the greatest thing he's ever encountered and wants to be an engineer like his grandfather, which I find both flattering and, knowing 7-year-olds, probably temporary. Rosalind is less interested in woodworking and more interested in the fact that I always have the specific brand of orange juice she likes in the refrigerator, which I buy every week without fail, because that is what grandfathers do. They don't know about the trust yet. They will when they're old enough to understand it. What I want them to understand when they do learn about it is not the amount. Money is just a number. What I want them to understand is what it represents, that someone loved them quietly and specifically, in a way that required no recognition and no thanks, and planned for their futures before they were old enough to ask anyone to. That's what Lorraine would have done. That's what I'm doing in her absence. I think about what I would tell someone in a similar situation. Not the financial part. Everyone's numbers are different. But the rest of it. The part about being treated as a resource rather than a person. The part about sitting in a kitchen that smells like your wife's recipe and hearing the word generous used against you. I would tell them this: there is a particular kind of dignity that comes from leaving without a scene, from deciding quietly and then acting, from refusing to argue about your own worth with people who have already decided what you're worth to them. I'm not a vengeful man, I want to say that plainly. What I did wasn't revenge. I didn't set out to punish anyone. I set out to stop participating in an arrangement that had been established without my full understanding of its terms, and to build something better for myself and for the people I actually love. The rocking chair is coming along. The wood is white oak, hard to work with, takes patience, but the grain is beautiful, and it lasts. Lorraine would have liked it. She would have liked a balcony too. She would have liked a balcony too. I think about that sometimes, in the early mornings when the coffee is good and the light is coming up through the trees and everything is quiet. I think about it and I don't feel sad. I feel grateful for 38 years with a woman who taught me the value of my own company, and for the long, unhurried mornings I have now to remember her right. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened in that house. Not the argument. There wasn't really an argument. That's the part that still strikes me sometimes, sitting out here on my balcony in the mornings. There was no blow-up, no dramatic confrontation, no slammed doors. Just a man telling me over a kitchen table that I had been a guest in my own family's life, and me saying, "Okay," and meaning it in a way he didn't understand yet. What Thomas didn't know, what I think he genuinely could not see, was that the moment he said generous, he had already lost. Not because I was going to punish him, but because cause and effect doesn't ask for your permission before it starts working. You treat a person like a resource long enough, and eventually that person stops being available. That's not revenge. That's just the natural consequence of a choice playing out on its own timeline. What I keep coming back to is the question of what I could have seen sooner and chose not to. I'm an engineer. I built a career on reading systems accurately, understanding what each component actually does, identifying when something is operating outside its intended design. And yet I walked into that house with 2 years' worth of grief softening my judgment, and I told myself a story about being needed that was only half true. The half that was true: those children needed me, Eli and Rosalind. They needed the consistency, the pickup on Tuesdays, the pot roast, the grandfather who showed up. That part was real. The other half, the part where I told myself Thomas and Cassandra valued me as a person rather than a function, that was the story I wanted to be true. And I let myself believe it because believing it was easier than the alternative, which was sitting alone in the Westerville house with Lorraine's blue curtains and admitting that I was 50% afraid to be by myself. That's the honest version. I was afraid, and I let that fear lead me somewhere I shouldn't have stayed as long as I did. But here's what I know now that I didn't know then: the willingness to leave. To actually pack the truck and drive away without a scene, without begging, without renegotiating your own dignity. That takes something. It takes having spent enough years building something real inside yourself that you know it travels with you. It doesn't stay in the house. It doesn't depend on who's in the room. Thomas couldn't take it from me. He could only show me where I'd temporarily misplaced it. The rocking chair I'm building for Eli is white oak. It's stubborn material. It pushes back. You have to slow down and pay attention to the grain or it'll split on you and waste a week of work. But when you get it right, it lasts longer than you will. It'll be in that boy's house when he's my age, maybe longer. That's what I want to pass down. Not the money, though the trust will be there when they're ready for it. The thing I actually want Eli and Rosalind to inherit is simpler than that. The knowledge that your worth is not negotiable. That quiet and dignified action speaks longer than any argument you could win in a kitchen, and that it is always better to build something sturdy than to fight over something hollow. Lorraine knew that. She knew it from the day I met her. I'm just getting there a little slower, out here on my east-facing balcony with a cup of coffee and the whole morning ahead of me.